I'm Jenna Seery, a bookseller and co-host of Port Over, and today I am so excited to be joined by Cameron Sullivan, author of The Red Winter. This is a book that I have been thinking about and talking about for a long time because it is the kind of fantasy historical combo that I love. So, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Jenna. Thank you for having me.
So, since this is your debut novel and it has a wonderful premise, I was hoping you could start us off by setting up the book a little bit and explaining how you came to this story and decided it was the book you wanted to write.
Also, the
Easy
book.
questions.
Follows Professor Sebastian Grave, who's an immortal occultist who shares his body with the demon Sarmadel, and it follows one of their, I guess, most interesting cases in his mind, which is the hunt for the Beast of Gevaudan, which is a real event that happened in pre-revolutionary France. So that would be, I guess, the overarching uh, narrative of the book, but it's, I guess, at its heart, it's there's a love story. There's an exploration of the historical forces at play at that time, which are about power and war, and also humanity. So that's it's quite ambitious. It addresses a lot of topics, and the reason I was attracted to it, I think, is because the history itself is so interesting and quite well documented. So the Beast of Gevaudan was a real event, and it was a kind of mysterious animal that was attacking and killing people in France in 1764, sort of through to 1767, and it attacked and killed a phenomenal number of people in that time. I think in 2 years, some estimates are that it attacked over 200 and killed over 100 people, which, if that were happening today, would be down tools what's going on. And there's the source material, the research really gave me the story in a lot of ways. There's so much beautiful artwork. It's very visual in terms of source material because there's sort of wanted posters because so many people got involved, the king and the church and the local authorities, the local nobility. And there's also sort of letters from people who were involved in hunting the beast. And it goes from kind of their kind of pride at being selected by the king for this incredible honor through to towards the end of the hunt when they just can't catch this thing. There's a kind of a despair and a really kind of personal, people are kind of moved by what's going on around them, people dying and feeling helpless. So much really rich material there. And I just wanted to tell that story in a way that was kind of behind the history.
I love books that allow us to do that, to take something that really happened, but go off in a different tangent or really try to put some pieces together in a different way. So is that where it started for you, coming upon this history and then it got the wheels turning?
Absolutely. And I think the thing that really kind of rings the bells in my head is there's lots of elements to this that at the time seemed quite supernatural. So there were theories about whether the beast was a werewolf or was it an incarnation of the devil. And the church was, what we would consider very superstitious now. The church was kind of telling people that it was a sort of divine or demonic kind of punishment. And there are a lot of conflicting accounts of what the beast was, lots of eyewitness accounts. And so in those kind of uncertainties and gaps, that's where I see the story. There's a real possibility to fill in those gaps with my own narrative. And I guess I started from what if it were all true? What if all the supernatural things were the real story, and the folklore that grew out of them is what we know today. So that was incredibly exciting for me. And I think the connections to the greater history of Europe grew out of that more than the other way around. I found there's so much interconnectedness between particularly the folklore and the mythology around the events that it was, I wouldn't say it was easy because it definitely wasn't, but it was very satisfying to make those connections and write them.
Researching this book must have been really fun. You have like so many pieces that come into this from the French history, you've got Roman history, you've got so much with plants and the like native sort of history of the like nature around them. There's so many pieces that go into the research of this, plus all of the just little facts. You've got Joan of Arc. There's so much in there. Were you really just like creating a board with strings, connecting all of these things together?
That's a lot closer to the truth than I'd like to admit. Yes, like the research, and I like one of the biggest dangers for me when I'm writing is just getting distracted by the research. I just go down rabbit holes constantly. I did have a board that was, because there are separate timelines in the book, that was essentially all of the chapters were kind of a post-it, and I had them pinned in order. So it was this kind of weird flow chart, which I now use a spreadsheet for, which is much more practical. But absolutely, like it was the complexity of the interconnected timelines was I think took years of my life getting that all together at the end. But the absolutely a labor of love. It's so great when they come together and it works.
Absolutely. Next book, you're like one timeline, one character. That's it.
Nobody talks. Yeah.
I really like the way you balance the historical research with what is clearly like the supernatural bits that you're bringing to it, because I think that's a really tough um scale to have, of like you really want to make sure there's all that history so everything makes sense, but you're there to talk about the supernatural fun stuff too. And it makes me think of books like Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, where there's like this wonderful balance between, yes, I know these things actually all happened, and also, what if all this other stuff was happening too?
Yeah, and that I think, and I'm definitely, and I feel like I need to say this all the time. I'm definitely, in terms of historical fantasy, it's definitely leaning into the fantasy more than the historical. It's not meant to be an accurate retelling in any sense. But I think in terms of if there was a rule that I followed in the balance of that, it would be that it can't, whatever I do in the history side of things and the fantasy side of things, can't change our understanding of the world now. So what I want for people when they're reading it is to be wondering, what if, like, this could have happened in it all fits. It could have happened in this way, and we just don't know about it. So I kind of, that was the boundary of the fantasy for me. Couldn't be kind of world breaking in the sense of the real world. And other than that, it was actually not, I guess, because it's in the past, so no one's going to go back and check it. But there is so much superstition and what we would call fantasy in the history itself. People, even you mentioned Joan of Arc, like even in her kind of trial transcripts, there are things that we would never consider entering into a court. Was she a witch? Was she talking to God? These are fantasy things that I didn't even need to add because they were already there. I just made them real. So in that sense, again, it kind of wrote itself.
And you wish you could go back and say that to yourself when you're like in the midst of writing it. You're like, it wrote itself. um, I really appreciate the idea that like it can't change what we think of now. I feel like the first time I ever read a book that I had that feeling about was The Historian, because it was the same thing with the sort of Dracula myth of like, oh, but what if all of this is actually been true this whole time? I don't know. I'm not saying it's not. I don't have any proof it's not.
Well, how would we know? Well, and that's the thing. And I think what I have come away with, having done, and I love history, so this was not a chore, but having done a lot more history research than I probably was planning to, is that it is all stories. And
Mhm.
that old saying, history is written by the victors, is very true. And the French Revolution following immediately on from this time period, a lot of history was literally rewritten or destroyed. So there's a real feeling of being part of a a ongoing tradition of kind of rewriting history, which happens all the time. And I think we just don't, we assume that history is facts when it's really, it is just an evolving story that we are actively participating in retelling a lot of the time.
I think that's part of why so many of us are drawn to books like this, and stories like this right now, when it feels like there is so much history happening always, and wondering how we will look back on the times that we're living in and the ways that we're even describing what happened 20 years ago, what happened 10 years ago. And I think something like adding a fantastical element allows us to take a lens and process some of the things that we're experiencing. I think that's why we keep coming back to these stories.
I think that's true. There's something very kind of archetypal about these kind of, I guess, human characters. So there's, uh, for example, before the French Revolution, tremendous imbalance in wealth and power. Uh, the powerful players in that time, there was enough for everybody. There was no reason for people to be impoverished and dying and held in miserable conditions. It was greed and power and the usual terrible influences on humanity. And I think we are and unintentionally, obviously, I wrote the book quite a while ago, but it's a very timely way of understanding our current situation. It allows you to kind of zoom out and see everything, see the whole picture without being in it, as we seem to be at the moment in our own situation.
And I really like being able to look at it through the lens of characters. And I think that in this book, there are so many wonderful characters that we get to become very close to and really understand. I love Sebastian. I think he is such an interesting person to get to experience this with because he has such a scope of knowledge entering into all of these different situations that is makes him very unique and makes his perspective very unique and very exciting for us to go along with. And at the same time, he's one of those characters where I'm like, sometimes the decisions you make me want to take a break because I cannot believe with all your knowledge you're still making these choices.
That was He's such a fun character to write in that sense because um, he's the smartest person in the room all the time. But he is, I guess, guided by this demon in his mind who is the worst influence. Whenever I was stuck in a scene, I would sort of say, what's the worst thing that he could do right now? And that's the advice that I would have Sarmadel give him in his ear. And that's a lot of fun because it's instant conflict, it's just such rich ground for storytelling and character work. And having him be at the same time this kind of super intelligent tour guide of the past, with an understanding, with a kind of contemporary understanding because he lives forever. Like the kind of convergence of all of my nerd interests at the same time. It was a lot of fun. Also very difficult because um, being such a smart character, I would have to, in some ways, be smarter than myself to make it believable.
I love that. I really, his humor is something that I think makes this book really so propulsive because it is such a dark book in many ways that without that sort of balance of tone, I think we would all feel like we were right there in it in a way that might be too much. But I love that he's so funny and that we get this great glimpse into his mind and that his relationships with people around him always seem to be changing and growing and moving in ways that are really fun to read. My personal favorite character is Livia, and I think that she makes this book for me. But there's so many great side characters.
Livia, I mean, if I'm going to go on record, my favorite character of the whole thing is Sarmadel, just because
Mhm.
as a writer, he's such a great pressure release valve for whatever isn't going right with the scene. He can come in and make it great. And the humor, and even with Livia, she's ridiculous. She's funny because she's absolutely absurd. Um, but I think particularly with Sebastian, a lot of the humor does help to humanize them in the sense that there's a reason people are funny, and it's usually not because they just enjoy making people laugh. There's a vulnerability that they're hiding by performing and being funny. And I think in Sebastian's case, he is hiding it. He's very wounded. He's quite a broken man underneath his very smart facade. And I think his humor is a way of kind of deflecting or putting off his own real feelings about things by making people laugh. And I I hope that was the humor, to be honest, was the most difficult thing because the book is so dark and you don't want to there were a lot of things I had to take out because they were trivializing really awful things. And also because I don't know, it's such a risk. If it didn't pay off, it was just me sitting in a room in front of my computer laughing at my own jokes, which is not it's not something anybody wants to do.
No, but yet we all have. So I know that feeling of of experiencing. And like you said, it is dark. I think this was one of the gorier fantasy books I've read in a while, which I really appreciate. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about writing some of the like fight scenes because I always find those so interesting because there's so many different ways they can go and they really make this book very unique.
The fight scenes are so to give you kind of a glimpse into the process, I think I kind of write those kind of landmark scenes first a lot of the time,
Mhm.
which are, the fun, action, gory, gritty, those scenes, and the really deep character scenes. Um, the I don't know what this says about me, but the gore comes very easily to me. I'm a huge horror
Love it.
fan, like it's my first
Yeah.
love. And the most difficult part of those scenes is, I guess, the choreography of it all, is
Mhm.
making sure that it all stays very clearly positioned when you're reading it in a way that doesn't slow down the action, because you've got to make sure that everybody is where they need to be to do what they're doing. And people can't be kind of injured and put out of commission too early to advance the story. So there's a lot of those things were much more difficult than the gore, which was, I guess, quite fun to write in a lot of ways. There's a real the kind of evocative sensory elements, even if it's disgust or kind of that real cringe you get when someone gets injured, that feels like successful writing it feels very good when you're doing it. So yeah.
And to round it out, you've got humor, you've got these gory horror elements, and you've got a love story. You really were like, I'm going to get everything in here in the best way. And I really appreciate that because I think it's only natural that those things kind of all go together. I always feel like humor and horror and romance are kind of all sides of the same coin if you keep turning it because it is conflict. It is the right things at the right time or the wrong things at the wrong time. And I love that the way that they weave together in this book.
Yeah, the love story was, I mean, the book starts with a love story. That's the kind of reason for the telling in a lot of ways. And I think it was really important for me to have that. Sebastian's character, I don't think, would have been complete without that in a lot of ways. And it the balance that I wanted to get, and I think, and I hope this comes across when people read the book, there's a very human love story, and Sebastian is immortal. So there's a real kind of doomed, very it's a terrible mistake. Like it's a bad decision to get involved with this young nobleman in this incredibly dangerous hunting situation. But he does it anyway. So there's that very human, very reckless love, which was uh, and just sentimental and romantic and all the things you're not supposed to be when you're a smart person. So that was beautiful. But then there's also the love story between Sebastian and Sarmadel, which I think is the grander love story, which will always be there for Sebastian. So he doesn't have he's got he is very conflicted with where his heart lies a lot of the time. And Sarmadel is not at all invested in his human love story, apart from the obvious payoff at the end where he gets to eat them. So I really wanted to show that side of Sebastian, like the history and the horror, incredibly interesting. But I think to care about them, you really had to identify with the human side of the characters, and the love story was such a beautiful way to do that. And French Revolution, there's just so much high emotion. It's already got a kind of Les Mis kind of romantic cast to it before the revolution, so it was a very natural. It felt very natural to write it that way.
Right. And I think it's something that I always find interesting in these books with like gods or deities or supernatural creatures. It goes back to sort of this like or Greek ideal that the gods are very human, that like these supernatural beings, we've assigned a lot of human traits and needs and wants to them. And I think that it goes into the way that we again tell the stories about these creatures, that even when they seem to be acting in these omniscient ways, we always in through the stories sort of narrow it down into these same base desires that we have as humans.
Yeah, and I think that's something that I wanted to get right with this, in the sense that the overarching sort of spiritual supernatural forces were not removed from the world. They were a direct reflection of um, those terrible impulses that you're talking about, and grew from them. So the god of war, or the spirit of war, is a direct reflection of having been fed on war, on human war, for centuries. And I wanted to maintain that sense of agency, that we are creating our own gods and demons all the time.
And it certainly comes up again and again for these characters as they sort of navigate this world of it's such an interesting political situation they were in, like you mentioned, and also this sort of changing religious aspect where the church is having more and more and more influence, and watching the dynamic shift between some of these like pre-Christianity ideas or spirits into this newer world is really interesting. I think it brings up a lot of interesting of things that I hadn't necessarily thought about. I was definitely doing some Googling as I was reading, I will say.
I'm glad. The footnotes in the book are kind of designed to help with that a little bit, and it's definitely not necessary, I don't think, to do that when you're reading the book. But I used to love that about reading when I was younger, when there was no Google, and I would find something that I was really fascinated with, and explore it, and that would really enhance my enjoyment of the book. I really loved the learning element of that. But I think the continuity of spirituality and culture, and our understanding of the kind of mystical, supernatural, spiritual world, I really wanted to get that across in the book. The way that, in spite of changing the names and and who we're kind of praying to, the basic function of spirituality has remained the same. So from Bronze Age through to classical Greece, to the Roman Empire, through the Middle Ages, through to this moment in the book where the church has kind of reached the pinnacle of its power, really, in the 1700s, and the Enlightenment's about to pull the rug out from everyone. There's a real it is all the same story. We tend to think of, people think the Roman Empire, and it's this finite period in history when things were all made of marble and people wore togas, and that was kind of the deal. And then the medieval, there's knights riding on horses, whereas the story is much more fluid, and they all flow into one another in a very logical way. So that was probably more than I could fit into the book, which is already quite big. But that was the fact that the past is always there, and we never leave it behind. That, particularly with our religion and spiritual practice, that was something that I really wanted to get across.
It made me think of a few years ago, Simon Montefiore put out this book called The World, and it's like a million page history of the world through stories and families and culture. And it tells the story in that way through, not through like, and now we're talking about this period of time in this place, but it's very much story based. And I think it is really, it's not the way we're taught history. It's not the way we're taught about the world, about what was happening at the same time. I feel like me and the people, I'm constantly talking to people and realizing I didn't know two things were happening at the same time because we're not taught that piece of it. It's always so linear and not really looking at that entire picture. And I think that it really funnels our view of history into one thing.
That's so true, and it's I think it's in some ways the only way to teach history in a way that's achievable. You've got to kind of cut it down into bite-sized pieces, but the that kind of enduring story, particularly, I mean, European history is obviously my passion, and that's what I would know the most about. The continuity of that is fascinating to me. The fact that it's all iterations on iterations on iterations of these core, fundamental, moral, spiritual, religious, whatever you want to call them, building blocks. And they're so important to us. And we feel like ours is original and new. And it's not, it comes from everything. There was that, I don't even know what to call it, like a phenomenon online where everyone was talking about the Roman Empire. Like, how many times a day do people think about the Roman Empire?
Mhm.
And that is no surprise to me at all. Like, there's so much of that, particularly Rome, but also other periods that are around us all the time, and they underpin so many of our current systems, and that's, I think, something that's invisible to people a lot of the time.
I think even like the French Revolution as a concept is so, there are so many phrases or like pieces of history that have like sunk into culture from that time period. And yet often when I go back and do research or I'm reading about it, I'm like, oh, there's so many things in here that I didn't even realize. Like, I didn't know that was from this time, or I never knew that that happened, even though I feel like I've read so much about this.
Yeah, or things that are just plain wrong, that have just become this
Yes.
folklore around certain characters, or Marie Antoinette, great
Yeah.
example. Like, there's so much that we um, again construct history in our own minds from little anecdotes or stories or famous quotes, things like that. And the real pleasure of the research for me is getting to the bottom of those things. I guess finding the real story, if there is such a thing, and
Mhm.
then yeah, turning it into a kind of gory, funny, romantic narrative.
With footnotes. I love the footnotes in the book. Again, I don't know if I want to call them a dying art, but I do feel like we need more books with footnotes.
Oh, I dread to think how many footnotes I had to get rid of. It's so tempting, and I think, I don't know if lazy is the correct word, but it's a little bit of a cheat code for writers, in the sense that there's so much of it, because it's so heavily researched. There's so much I want to say about everything in the book, and the footnotes are a really great way to say it in character, in Sebastian's character. So it's
Mhm.
and he'll always have something a little bit dry or um, funny to say about it, or a little bit judgmental most of the time. And I, yeah, they're as much fun as they are to read. They're incredibly fun to write as well. And a lot of people do not like footnotes, and I think they're a little bit challenging in terms of things like audiobooks and,
Sure.
you know, those different formats. Although the shout out to the audio production people, they did a brilliant job with it. Um, I totally understand that some people don't enjoy them because they can feel a bit distracting. And I wrote them so they're not, you don't have to read them to enjoy the book. They are little asides. They're things that I want you to, absolutely. They make it for me, but they're not, none of them are essential to understanding and enjoying the book.
I'm saying for the people listening that they're essential to the enjoyment of the book. I need everyone to read
Yay!
them.
I definitely want people to read them, but I don't want people to be put off by them because they're fun.
They are.
They're so much fun.
And I think that that's another like important piece of this because we've talked a lot about like the complexity and like all this, but this is a really fun book. Like being able, and I think that that is important to remember as I'm like talking about how dark and gory and sad. Like I think this is so propulsive, and I think that that makes reading something like this something that bridges that fantasy history genre. That's what makes it so special is that it gets to be really, really fun.
Yeah, I think again this goes back to my love of horror. The enjoyment of a horror book, horror story, horror film is that it's fun in a lot of ways. I mean, the ones that are genuinely horrifying are, I find quite confronting. There's a lot of, the kind of torture porn sort of genre
Mm-hmm.
I don't enjoy as much, and I did not want the book to be that. The fun, there's still the adventure, there's overcoming adversity, there's people falling in love, there's character development, there's a whole bunch of genuine human experience that kind of carries the characters through quite dark times. And I think having Sebastian as the narrator have a little bit of distance in terms he's kind of talking about his past, and gives little critiques and has opinions and remembers things fondly, that I think made it fun for me as well, because it was there was real potential for it to be a very grim, dark slog.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think one of the best things about his character and Sarmadel as well, who's incredibly dark, is that them kind of bouncing off each other lightens that and makes it an adventure as well.
And I think what adds to it is, not again, I've been trying not to say too many spoilery things because there's so many like good moments, but we don't leave the book with all the answers. There are still so many things that because Sebastian doesn't know, we don't know the answers to certain things. And I really like that in a book. I don't want to be told every single little thing.
No, and I wanted to keep that because I have so many more stories in me with these characters. It's uh, there's so much to explore.
Mm-hmm.
I have the answers. These are not mysteries to me, but I wanted to keep that sense of wonder about what was going on and things. The idea of magic and the supernatural as something that's not always explicable. There's a real power to things that we can't explain, which again is why spirituality and religion are so powerful for us. We are really drawn to things. Human beings are really drawn to things that move us that we can't explain. So I wanted to keep a bit of that mystery around him, and even in terms of the what comes next, because he's lived for so long, he can't tell it all. So there has to be, he has to put the frame on the story somewhere. And I didn't want to tie it up in a bow. I feel like and that's not how history works either. So I enjoyed that element of it a lot.
So we'll all just have to wait and see and, write our Sebastian fan fiction in the meantime. I wonder too if we could talk a little bit about your literary influences and some books that you love that have, shaped you into a reader and writer.
Oh, wow.
And
It's
now,
very
of
difficult to
course,
choose.
we'll forget every book we've ever read as we
I feel like I'm having a stroke. In terms of my favorite, or in terms of influences on this book, I would say definitely authors like Jonathan Stroud, and I think people have noted this, the kind of footnoted, humorous take on.
Samarkand, Amulet of Samarkand.
Oh my goodness, so great! And I
Yeah.
loved those, all of those
Mm-hmm.
books. The Bartimaeus sequence, beautiful. And I think the Witcher, obviously, there's a lot of kind of clear parallels there. I loved that idea of a kind of dark sorceress history, or people pulling the strings of politics and wealth behind the scenes. I think in terms of my favorite authors, the ones who I think in terms of writing, and I sort of even growing up and I was like, that's what I want to do. David Eddings was one of my favorite authors. Anne Rice, incredible. And Stephen King, possibly my ultimate, just in terms of a volume, how, and just the way that he can draw characters in a way that makes you feel like you know them. That's so incredible to me. So those, I think, would be in terms of writing, my chief influences. And there will be dozens more that I just can't think of at the moment. And then I think the historians, the people that I've been reading, whose, again, names I can't remember, which is dreadful. There's so much, Mary Beard, obviously, for the Roman content. There's so much that goes into, and so much careful writing that goes into history, which I obviously just threw out the window and made it my own story, but deeply indebted to all of those people who went to the trouble of combing through the sources and making sure that these events stayed alive.
I love that. I think that I can totally see how all of those come together for this book. I love getting to get that little insight and be like, oh yeah, okay, I can see how it comes. But I can't wait for people to be able to read this book. I can't wait for other people to talk about it with. And I think that people are really going to love Sebastian. So Cameron Sullivan, thank you so much for joining us today. And we'll see Red Winter on the shelves soon.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.